If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Richard adjusted his Italian tie for the third time while observing the worn facade of the building in Greenwich Village. Day bookstore. He almost laughed at the irony. There he was at 42, owner of one of the largest construction companies in New York City, standing in front of an establishment that, according to his own real estate valuation criteria, wasn't worth even a tenth of what the land could yield if properly utilized. The heat of that Saturday afternoon was suffocating, typical of a New York summer. Beads of sweat began to form on his forehead, even under the air conditioning of his imported car. His driver waited patiently, not asking questions about the sudden stop in a neighborhood that wasn't on the day's agenda. Richard stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his Armani suit that seemed out of place on this street of popular commerce. His steps were decisive, as they always had been in his life. After all, decisiveness was his trademark in the business world, but something made him hesitate at the bookstore door. Perhaps the delicate bell that tinkled when he pushed it, or the smell of old books that instantly transported him to long-buried memories. The interior of the shop was an organized labyrinth of dark wooden shelves, some reaching to the ceiling. The yellowish lighting created a welcoming, almost intimate atmosphere. Richard felt uncomfortable. Intimacy wasn't something he was accustomed to dealing with. His relationships were limited to contracts, negotiations, and occasionally business. Dinners with high society women that lasted exactly as long as a successful business transaction. That's when he saw her. Between the shelves, organizing books with almost religious concentration, was a woman who seemed not to belong to the same universe as him. Her brown hair was tied in a disheveled bun, some rebellious strands framing a face that didn't need makeup to be remarkable. She wore a long cotton skirt and a simple blouse, but there was something in her posture that emanated a natural elegance, different from everything he knew in the social circles he frequented. "Can I help you?" Her voice caught him by surprise. He hadn't realized that he'd been standing there, observing her for several minutes. Her green eyes looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and serenity that disconcerted him. I'm looking for a book," he replied, immediately realizing the obviousness of his statement. She smiled, a small and genuine smile that made something inside him move uncomfortably. "Well, you're in the right place," she answered, and there was a touch of amusement in her voice. "Any specific title?" Richard realized he hadn't thought about that. In fact, he didn't even know exactly why he had entered the store. That Saturday afternoon should have been dedicated to reviewing important contracts, not an unplanned incursion into a neighborhood bookstore. "Something about architecture," he improvised, grasping at the familiar. She studied him for a moment as if she could read something beyond his words. Without saying anything, she walked between the shelves with the familiarity of someone who knows every inch of the place. Richard followed her, feeling strangely disoriented in this unknown territory. She stopped in front of a specific shelf and, after a few seconds of searching, pulled out a navy blue book. The golden letters were partially faded by time. "This might interest you," she said, handing him the volume. "It's a rare edition on the evolution of modernist architecture in America. It has a fascinating chapter about how projects transformed the urban landscape of New York." Before handing over the book, she did something that captured all of Richard's attention. She took from a small pocket in the apron she wore a fabric bookmark, delicately embroidered with a blue flower, and placed it between the pages. It was a simple gesture, almost automatic, but there was something deeply personal about it. Richard took the book, his fingers lightly brushing against hers during the handover. A brief, accidental contact, but one that sent an electric current through his body. She didn't seem to notice, already turning to organize other volumes. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, his voice sounding strangely hoarse. $250, she replied without looking back. "It's a first edition." Richard took his wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket, extracting 3 $100 bills. "Keep the change," he said, in a tone he normally used to close negotiations. She finally turned, and there was something different in her look. "I don't work with tips, Mr. Richard," he introduced himself, surprised by the refusal. "Richard Matthews. Mr. Matthews, she continued, already heading to the old cash register in the corner of the store. Here we sell books, not favors. As she counted the change with precision, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine interest in someone, not for what the person could offer in terms of business or status, but for the person herself. Emily stored the payment notes in the old cash register drawer, her fingers unconsciously brushing against the worn fabric that lined the interior. That piece of furniture, like practically everything in the bookstore, had a history. It was the same cash register that her mother had used for years when the store was still in Soho, before impossible rents forced them to migrate to Greenwich Village. The man, Richard Matthews, was still standing near the counter, holding the book as if he didn't know exactly what to do with it. There was something intriguing about his posture, a mixture of authority and discomfort that she rarely saw in her regular customers. Normally, the people who frequented title books were university professors, students, and literature enthusiasts who knew every corner of the shelves better than their own apartments. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" she asked, more out of habit than necessity. The workday was almost over, and she still needed to check inventory before closing. "Your name," he said, surprising her. "You know mine, but I still don't know yours." Emily hesitated for a moment. She didn't usually share personal information with customers, especially with men in suits who seemed to have stepped right out of a business magazine. "Emily," she finally replied, keeping her surname to herself. "Emily," he repeated, as if testing how the name sounded. "Do you always put bookmarks in the books you sell?" The question caught her off guard. The bookmarks were a tradition of hers, something she had started doing a few years ago, inspired by a distant memory she treasured. "Only in the special ones," she answered, allowing herself a small smile. "And how do you know which ones are special?" "The books tell us," she replied, knowing that it sounded a bit too mystical for someone like him. "Just like the people who buy them?" Richard frowned, clearly not satisfied with the enigmatic answer. He was accustomed to numbers, projects, concrete things that could be measured and calculated. The idea that books could tell something seemed absurd to his Cartesian mind. "Have you always worked with books?" he asked, clearly trying to find more solid ground for the conversation. Emily began organizing some volumes on the counter, her hands moving with the familiarity of years of practice. "Books have always been part of my life," she answered, carefully choosing her words. "This bookstore was my mother's." "Was?" "Is," she corrected herself quickly. "It is my mother's. She just can't take care of the store personally anymore." A silence settled between them, filled only by the distant noise of traffic outside and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Emily could feel his gaze on her, studying her as he probably studied building plans or important contracts. "You should read chapter 3 first," she said, breaking the silence and pointing to the book he was still holding. "That's where the story really begins to make sense." Richard looked at the book in his hands as if he had forgotten its existence. "Have you read it?" "All the books here," she replied, allowing herself a moment of pride. "It's part of the job to know what we're selling." He nodded, an almost imperceptible gesture of approval. "And if I have questions about chapter 3? Emily knew it was a cue, a door he was trying to keep open. Under normal circumstances, she would politely close it, as she always did. Her life was complicated, enough without adding a curious businessman to the equation. But there was something in his eyes, a loneliness that she recognized too well to ignore. "The bookstore is open every day except Mondays," she replied, surprising herself. "Questions about literature are always welcome." Richard put the book in his Italian leather briefcase, moving toward the door with the same determination with which he had entered. But before leaving, he turned one last time. "The bookmark. Is it handmade?" "Yes," replied Emily, unconsciously touching the small pocket of her apron where she kept others like it. "Each one is unique." "Like the people who receive them?" The question hung in the air, and Emily felt something stir in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced for a long time. "Maybe," she answered simply. "I'll continue with the translation in my next response." The next morning, Richard found himself staring at the book on his desk in his office. The fabric bookmark with the delicately embroidered blue flower stood out between the pages, completely out of place in the minimalist and corporate environment that surrounded him. The glass walls of his penthouse in downtown New York offered a panoramic view of the city, but his eyes remained fixed on that small piece of cloth. "Mr. Matthews," his secretary's voice over the intercom brought him back to reality. "The people from the development company are waiting for the 9 o'clock meeting." "I'll be right there, Vanessa," he replied, instinctively adjusting his tie. Before leaving, his fingers lightly brushed the bookmark, and for a moment he could smell old books again. The meeting dragged on for 2 hours. Numbers, projections, real estate appreciation graphs. His usual world seemed strangely less interesting that morning. While his financial director presented the quarterly report, Richard found himself thinking about Emily's green eyes and how they seemed to hold stories he wanted to discover. "Richard," the voice of Jason, his partner for 15 years, brought him back. "Is everything okay? You seem distant." "Just thinking about the implications of the new project in Soho," he lied with ease. Years of negotiations had made him excellent at this. "Continue." But as soon as the meeting ended, Richard did something completely outside his routine. He cancelled his afternoon appointments. Vanessa, his secretary for a decade, could barely hide her surprise when he announced he would be leaving early. The journey to Greenwich Village seemed longer this time. His driver maintained his usual professional silence, but Richard could feel his curiosity through the rearview mirror. After all, it wasn't common for his boss to make 2 consecutive visits to a neighborhood that wasn't on his usual business route. The bookstore was different during the day. The natural light that entered through the high windows created interesting patterns on the shelves, and the doorbell sounded more cheerful when he entered. Emily was in the same place as the day before, but this time she was animatedly conversing with an elderly lady about Russian novels. Richard waited patiently, feigning interest in a nearby shelf. He observed how Emily gestured when talking about literature, how her eyes sparkled when recommending certain titles, how her smile was genuine when wrapping the books chosen by the customer. "Chapter 3 was very illuminating," he said as soon as the lady left, approaching the counter. Emily looked up, and for a moment Richard saw surprise on her face, quickly replaced by a contained smile. "So you actually read it?" "I confess I stayed up all night because of it," he replied, surprising himself with his own honesty. In fact, he had read not just chapter 3, but the entire book, something he hadn't done for pleasure since his college days. "And what did you think of the theory about how modern architecture transformed social relations in big cities?" she asked, and there was a gleam of genuine interest in her eyes. "Fascinating," he replied, leaning slightly on the counter, "especially the part about how spaces can shape behaviors. It made me question some of my own projects." "Your projects?" Richard hesitated for a moment. Normally, mentioning his position was a way to establish authority, but something told him that with Emily, this could have the opposite effect. "I'm an architect and developer," he said simply. "Ah," she replied, and there was a different note in her voice. "So you're one of those who are transforming the city?" It wasn't a direct accusation, but Richard felt the weight of the words. "Not all transformations are bad," he defended himself gently. "No," Emily agreed, organizing some books on the counter, "but some are irreversible." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken meanings. Richard observed how she handled the books with almost reverential care, as if each volume was an invaluable treasure. Her fingers were delicate but firm, and he noticed small ink stains on her unpolished nails. "Do you also write?" he asked, pointing to the stains. Emily instinctively hid her hands, a gesture that intrigued him. "Sometimes," she replied vaguely, "when other people's books aren't enough." Richard wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what she meant by that, but something in her posture stopped him. There was a subtle barrier there, a story she wasn't ready to share. "Do you have any recommendations for today?" he asked, instead changing the subject. Emily studied him for a moment, as if evaluating something beyond the simple request for a book. Then, without saying anything, she walked to a distant shelf and returned with a thin volume, bound in faded, red leather. "This one," she said, handing him the book. "It's about a man who built houses for others, but never found his own home." Richard took the book, his fingers brushing against hers again. This time the contact lasted a second longer than necessary. "It seems personal," he commented, leafing through the yellowed pages. "All good books are," Emily replied, and there was something in her voice that made Richard look up from the book. "That's why we read them, isn't it? To find pieces of ourselves in other people's stories." Emily closed the bookstore that night with conflicting thoughts. The small apartment she shared with her mother was only 2 blocks away, but the path seemed longer than usual. Richard Matthews's visits had disturbed the tranquil routine she had so carefully built over the years. She climbed the stairs of the old building to the 3rd floor, her legs accustomed to the daily exercise. The elevator had been broken for months, and the building manager always had a new excuse for the delay in fixing it. Upon opening the door, the familiar smell of chamomile tea greeted her. "Emily? Is that you, honey?" Her mother's weak voice came from the bedroom. "Yes, Mom," she replied, leaving her purse on the table in the small living room and heading to the bedroom. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah was sitting on the bed, surrounded by old books and notebooks. Her face, though pale, maintained a serenity that Emily had always admired. "Better," she answered with a weak smile. "I've been organizing some old things." Emily sat on the edge of the bed, observing the scattered papers. There were newspaper clippings, old photographs, loose pages from diaries. Her mother used to do this when longing hit her hard. She relived memories through the fragments she religiously kept in boxes under the bed. "I found this," said Sarah, holding out a yellowed envelope. "I thought you might like to see it." Emily carefully took the envelope. Inside was an old photograph of the bookstore in its early days in Soho. The sign was still new, the shelves gleamed with recent varnish, and her mother, much younger, smiled at the camera, with a baby in her arms. "I was just a few months old here," commented Emily, gently passing her fingers over the image. "Yes," confirmed Sarah, and there was something in her voice that made Emily look up. "It was shortly after your father." The silence that followed was familiar. It was always like this whenever the subject of Emily's father came up. Unfinished. Sentences, averted looks, sudden changes of subject. Emily had learned not to insist, but each time this happened, she felt as if another piece of an impossible puzzle was lost. "We had interesting visitors at the bookstore today," said Emily, deliberately changing the subject. "Oh." Sarah adjusted herself in bed, her eyes gaining a sparkle of interest. Even sick, she never lost her enthusiasm when the subject was the bookstore. "A new customer, an architect." Emily tried to keep a casual tone, but something in her voice must have betrayed something more because her mother looked at her more attentively. "An architect?" repeated Sarah, and Emily noticed a subtle tremor in her hands. "What is he like?" "Tall, well-dressed, the business type," replied Emily, finding her mother's sudden interest strange. "Why? What's wrong?" "Nothing," Sarah replied quickly, beginning to collect the papers scattered on the bed. "Just curiosity. Did you give him one of your special bookmarks?" Emily nodded, remembering the moment when she placed the bookmark with the blue flower in Richard's book. It had been an impulse, something she couldn't explain even to herself. "Those ones you taught me to make," she said, smiling at her mother. "With the embroidered flowers." Sarah paused her movements for a moment, her hands hovering over a pile of papers. "Sometimes, Emily, the most important things in life come to us disguised as coincidences." There was something in her mother's voice that made Emily feel uneasy. "What do you mean?" But Sarah had already resumed her task of organizing the papers, her face assuming that serene expression she used when she wanted to end a subject. "Nothing specific, dear, just philosophizing. Could you bring me more tea?" Emily got up, knowing she wouldn't get more information at that moment. In the kitchen, while preparing the tea, her mind wandered to Richard Matthews and the way he looked at the books, as if he were looking for something beyond the printed words. She returned to the bedroom with the steaming cup to find her mother, sleeping, an old book open in her lap. It was a familiar volume with a navy blue cover and partially faded golden letters, identical to the one she had sold to Richard the day before. Emily carefully took the book so as not to wake her mother, and as she moved it, a loose paper slipped from between its pages. It was an old card, yellowed by time with handwriting she didn't recognize. She began to read, but her mother stirred in the bed, and she quickly replaced the card in the book, putting it on the shelf next to the bed. That night, as she tried to sleep, Emily couldn't stop thinking about her mother's reaction to the mention of the architect, the mysterious card, and the growing feeling that there was much more to that story than she had ever imagined. Richard's visits to the bookstore became a constant over the following weeks. Always at the end of the afternoon, shortly before closing, he would appear with some question about the last book he had bought. Emily began to notice small changes in his appearance. The less adjusted tie, the occasionally absent jacket, a more relaxed air in his usually so controlled face. One of those afternoons while they discussed the meaning of a particularly enigmatic poem, Emily realized that she could no longer imagine her routines without those conversations. It was strange how someone who represented everything she used to criticize, impersonal progress, the soulless modernization of the city, had become such a significant part of her days. "You never told me why you chose architecture," she said, organizing some newly arrived books while Richard leafed through an old edition of modernist poetry. He looked up from the book, and for a moment, Emily saw something pass across his face, a shadow of memory perhaps. "I wanted to build things that would last," he finally replied, "something more permanent than people." The answer intrigued her. More permanent than people? Why? Richard closed the book slowly, as if he needed that moment to organize his thoughts. "People leave," he said simply. "Buildings stay." Emily felt the weight of those words. There was a story there buried beneath layers of professional success and emotional control. "Not always," she replied softly. "Some buildings are torn down to make way for others. Some people stay forever in our lives, even when they leave." Their gazes met, and Emily felt that familiar electric current that always happened when they were too close. Richard took a step toward her, but the bell at the door sounded, announcing the arrival of a customer. "Emily?" The familiar voice made her heart stop for a second. It was Mrs. Cooper, her mother's best friend, who had been visiting them regularly since Sarah fell ill. "Mrs. Cooper," Emily greeted, trying to keep her voice casual. "What a pleasant surprise." The elderly lady looked from Emily to Richard, and her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were busy. This is Richard Matthews," Emily introduced, noticing how Mrs. Cooper subtly paled upon hearing the name. "A frequent customer." "Matthews?" repeated Mrs. Cooper, her voice trembling slightly. "By any chance are you—" "Just a book enthusiast," Richard interrupted politely, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Mrs. Cooper shook his hand automatically, but her eyes sought Emily with an urgency that the young woman didn't understand. "Dear, could we talk for a minute in private?" Emily hesitated, looking at Richard. "I should be going anyway," he said, picking up his briefcase. "I have a meeting in half an hour. Today's book is already set aside," Emily completed, reaching under the counter for a volume bound in brown leather. As always, there was a bookmark with a blue flower between its pages. After Richard left, Mrs. Cooper held Emily's arm with surprising strength for someone her age. "How long has he been coming here?" "A few weeks," replied Emily, confused by her mother's friend's reaction. "Why? What's wrong?" Mrs. Cooper seemed to struggle internally for a moment. "Does your mother know about these visits?" "Yes, I mentioned them to her," said Emily, remembering her mother's strange reaction. "Mrs. Cooper, what's going on? Why does everyone act so mysteriously when I mention Richard?" The elderly lady released her arm and walked to the window, observing the busy street outside. "It's not my place to say anything," she finally said, "but perhaps you should ask your mother about the period when the bookstore was still in Soho. About certain customers from that time." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. "What customers?" "Just ask her," insisted Mrs. Cooper, turning to face her. And Emily Be careful with your heart. Sometimes the past has a peculiar way of repeating itself. After Mrs. Cooper left, Emily remained standing behind the counter, her mind a storm of questions. The book she had set aside for Richard was still there, and she opened it to the marked page. It was a novel about a family that kept a secret through generations, passing it from father to son like a cursed inheritance. For the first time since she began working at the bookstore, Emily felt afraid of the secrets that might be hidden among those old shelves, in the yellowed pages of the books that had always been her refuge. And more frightening still, she began to suspect that her heart was no longer solely in her own keeping. Richard parked his car in front of the impressive mirrored building that housed the headquarters of his construction company. But instead of getting out, he sat there looking through the windshield at the city he had helped transform. The book Emily had given him rested on the passenger seat, the blue bookmark once again marking a specific page. "Sir?" called his driver, concerned about his boss's unusual hesitation. "You can go, Thomas," replied Richard, taking his briefcase and the book. "I have some matters to take care of tonight." In the panoramic elevator that rose to his penthouse, Richard allowed himself a moment of reflection. The past few weeks had fundamentally changed something in his life, as if Emily had inadvertently reconfigured his way of seeing the world. Every building he had constructed, every deal he had closed, everything seemed different now. His private office occupied the entire top floor of the building. The glass walls offered a 360-degree view of New York City, a city he had always seen as a large investment project. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to see the stories behind each construction, the lives that pulsated within them. "Jason is waiting in the meeting room," informed Vanessa as soon as he exited the elevator. "He said it's urgent." Richard sighed, placing the book on his desk. "Tell him I'll be right there." Jason, his partner for 15 years, was hunched over a series of blueprints when Richard entered the meeting room. His normally jovial face was tense. "We need to talk about the Greenwich Village project," said Jason without preamble. "I just received an interesting call from the people at the development company." Richard felt his stomach tighten. The Greenwich Village project was one of his largest undertakings, a commercial and residential complex that would occupy almost an entire block in the neighborhood. "What kind of call?" "Apparently there's a dispute over one of the properties," explained Jason, spreading some documents on the table. "A small but strategic area, an old bookstore." Richard's blood froze. "Tidal Books?" Jason raised his eyebrows, surprised. "You know it?" "I've been there a few times," replied Richard, trying to keep his voice neutral. "It's a traditional establishment in the neighborhood." "Well, traditional or not, it's in the way of progress," declared Jason, using a phrase that Richard himself used to repeat in similar situations. "The interesting thing is that we discovered something about the property. Apparently there's an old legal issue involving the documentation of the building." Richard approached the window, trying to organize his thoughts. The city stretched below him, a sea of concrete and glass that now seemed suffocating. "What kind of issue?" "An unresolved inheritance dispute," explained Jason, leafing through some papers. "From the 90s. And here's the most interesting part. One of the names involved is Matthews." Richard turned abruptly. "What?" "Anthony Matthews," read Jason. "From what I've been able to gather, he was—" "My uncle," completed Richard, his voice low. "My father's younger brother." Jason put down the papers, studying his friend carefully. "Richard, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, that was exactly how Richard felt. Long-buried memories began to emerge, whispered conversations between his father and uncle, heated discussions about properties and family responsibilities, a name that was always mentioned with bitterness, Sarah. "I need to check some things," said Richard abruptly, heading for the door. "Cancel my appointments for tomorrow." "Richard, wait," called Jason. "What about the project? The development company wants an answer by the end of the week." But Richard was already in the elevator, his mind a torrent of thoughts. Emily's words about irreversible transformations echoed in his head. The strange reactions when he mentioned his surname, the tremor in Mrs. Cooper's hands. In his office, he picked up the book Emily had given him earlier that day. Upon opening it to the marked page, a small piece of paper fell out, an old photo yellowed by time. In it, a young woman smiled in front of a bookstore in Soho, and beside her was a man whom Richard immediately recognized, his uncle Anthony, much younger, with a smile he had never seen in any family photo. Richard sat heavily in his chair, the photo trembling in his hands. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a puzzle he never knew existed. The bookstore Emily, the family secrets. Everything was connected in a way he could never have imagined. Emily found her mother awake when she arrived home that night, something unusual for the time. Sarah was sitting in the living room armchair, an old photo album in her lap, and a distant expression on her face that Emily knew well. It was the look her mother had when navigating difficult memories. "Mrs. Cooper was at the bookstore today," said Emily, hanging up her purse and sitting on the sofa across from her mother. Sarah looked up from the album, and Emily noticed a subtle tremor in her hands. "And how is she?" "Agitated," replied Emily, carefully choosing her words. "Especially after meeting Richard Matthews." The album slipped from Sarah's lap, scattering some photos on the floor. Emily rushed to collect them, but one in particular caught her attention. It showed her mother, much younger, next to a man she had never seen before, in front of the old facade of the bookstore in Soho. "Who is he?" asked Emily, showing the photo to her mother. Sarah took the photograph with trembling hands. "Anthony," she whispered so softly that Emily could barely hear. "Anthony Matthews." The surname hit Emily like lightning. "Matthews, like Richard's uncle," completed Sarah, her voice taking on a tone that Emily had never heard before, a mixture of pain and longing, "and the man I loved a long time ago." Emily sat down again, feeling as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. "Why did you never tell me?" Sarah closed the album carefully, as if the gesture could somehow organize her thoughts. "Some stories are too difficult to tell, honey, especially when they involve so many people, so many choices, so many regrets." "But now you need to tell me," insisted Emily, her voice firm despite the emotion she felt. "It's not a coincidence that Richard appeared at the bookstore, is it?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Coincidences are just the knots that destiny ties when it wants to connect two stories." "Mom, please," pleaded Emily. "I need to know." Sarah got up with difficulty, walked to the bookshelf, and took out a navy blue cover book, the same one Emily had noticed in her room days ago. "Anthony was an architect like Richard," she began, caressing the book's cover. "He came to the bookstore almost every day, always with a different excuse to buy another book. In reality, he was buying time to see me, for us to talk, to dream." Emily watched her mother open the book with reverential care. Between its pages were old letters, notes yellowed by time. "We fell in love amid the books," continued Sarah. "Anthony had wonderful ideas for the city, projects that mixed the modern with the traditional. He understood that buildings weren't just concrete and glass. They were places where people lived their stories." "What happened?" asked Emily softly, seeing tears form in her mother's eyes. "His family happened," replied Sarah, her voice bitter. "The Matthews were one of the most powerful families in New York. Anthony was the youngest, the rebel, the dreamer. The older brother, Richard's father, took over the family business and had other plans. Plans that didn't include the younger brother falling in love with a simple bookstore owner." Emily felt her heart tighten. "They prevented him from staying." "With you?" "They did more than that," said Sarah, removing an old document from the pages of the book. "They used their influence to create problems with the bookstore's documentation. They threatened to take everything from me if Anthony didn't stay away, and he chose to leave." "Without fighting?" asked Emily, feeling a growing anger toward a man she had never met. "He fought in his own way," Sarah defended softly. "He left me this book, with all these hidden documents, evidence of what his family had done. He said that one day it might protect me, but I never used it. Not after. discovering I was pregnant. Emily felt the world spin. Pregnant, you mean? Yes, Emily, confirmed Sarah, finally letting tears run down her face. Anthony Matthews is your father. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Emily looked at her own hands, seeing them tremble like her mother's moments before. So many. Things were beginning to make sense. Richard's sudden interest in the bookstore, the strange reactions from everyone when they heard his surname, the secrets whispered for so many years. And now, continued Sarah, her voice breaking, the son of the man who destroyed our family is returning to the bookstore. And I see the way you look at him, Emily. It's the same way I used to look at Anthony. Emily stood up abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the energy boiling inside her. Why are you telling me this now? Because history has a terrible way of repeating itself, replied Sarah, holding the book against her chest. And because you need to know who you are, honey. You need to know where you come from before deciding where you're going. Richard spent the night awake, the old photo of his uncle with Sarah in his hands, turning it between his fingers as if he could extract more answers from the aged paper. The first lights of morning found him still in his office, surrounded by old documents he had unearthed from the company archives. The story that emerged from those papers was like a novel that Emily might have recommended to him, except that it was too real, too painful. His father, always so controlled and cold, had practically expelled his own brother from the family to protect the empire they had built. Anthony, the uncle Richard barely knew, had disappeared after that, leaving. Only rumors and stories whispered at family meetings. The phone rang, making him jump. It was Jason. Richard, where are you? We have the meeting with the investors in half an hour. Cancel it, replied Richard, his voice hoarse from fatigue. Cancel everything. What? Richard, are you okay? This isn't like you. Nothing is typical lately, Jason, said Richard, running his hand through his disheveled hair. I need to resolve some personal matters. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. This is about the bookstore, isn't it? Richard, whatever it is, don't let it interfere with business. The Greenwich Village project is too big to... The bookstore is out of the project, interrupted Richard, his voice cutting. We're not touching it. Have you lost your mind? We've already invested millions in planning. The land is crucial for... I said the bookstore is out, repeated Richard, slamming his hand on the desk. And that's not up for discussion. After hanging up, Richard grabbed his coat and left the office. The sun was already high when he parked in front of the bookstore, but the sign still said closed. Even so, he could see movement through the windows. Emily was inside organizing books as she always did before opening. His heart beat faster at the sight of her, and now that feeling was mixed with something more complex. She was his cousin, the daughter of the uncle his family had expelled, the girl who unknowingly was making him question everything he had ever believed in. He knocked on the door softly. Emily looked up from the books she was organizing and, for a moment, Richard saw something different in her look. Knowledge, perhaps. Pain. She walked to the door slowly, and Richard noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she turned the key. We need to talk, they both said at the same time, as soon as the door opened. A sad smile passed across Emily's face. You already know, don't you? Richard nodded, entering the bookstore. The familiar smell of old books now seemed loaded with new meanings. I found a photo yesterday. Your father. My Uncle Anthony. My mother told me everything last night, interrupted Emily, her voice soft but firm. About him. About your family, about what they did to the bookstore. Richard felt the weight of his family's guilt on his shoulders. Emily, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know any of this when I started coming here. I believe you, she replied, leaning against a shelf. But that doesn't change the fact that your company is planning to demolish this place, does it? The question hit him like a punch. How did you... News travels fast in the neighborhood, explained Emily, gesturing to the window that overlooked the street. Especially when it involves a real estate project of that size. I've already cancelled that part of the project, said Richard quickly. The bookstore won't be touched. Emily studied him for a long moment, her green eyes, the same eyes as Anthony in the photo, penetrating his. Because of me? Or out of guilt? The question caught him off guard. It was a distinction he himself hadn't considered yet. Maybe both, he admitted honestly. But mainly because, for the first time in my life, I'm seeing beyond the numbers, beyond the projects. I'm seeing the stories, the people, the lives we build or destroy with our decisions. Like your father didn't see, commented Emily, and there was a tinge of bitterness in her voice. I'm not my father, replied Richard, taking a step toward her, and you're not just my uncle's daughter. Emily backed away slightly, creating distance between them. No, she agreed, but we are who we are because of the choices they made. And now we have our own choices to make, completed Richard, his heart beating strongly in his chest. The silence that followed was dense, with unspoken possibilities, of paths that forked before them. The doorbell sounded softly with the morning breeze, as if reminding them that the world continued to turn out there, oblivious to the secrets and revelations that had transformed their lives in the last 24 hours. The days that followed were strange for Emily. The bookstore remained the same, with its smell of old paper and stored stories, but now each corner seemed to contain memories that weren't just hers. She looked at the shelves and imagined her father, Anthony, walking those same corridors, choosing books just to have a few more minutes with her mother. Richard didn't return in the following days, and Emily found herself looking at the door each time the bell rang. His absence was both a relief and a pain, like a book left halfway through with unanswered questions hanging between the pages. On a particularly quiet morning, Mrs. Cooper appeared at the bookstore. Her face was more serene than the last time, but still carried that expression of someone who keeps secrets too heavy to bear. "Your mother told me you two talked," she said, sitting in the old reading armchair near the counter. "How are you, dear?" Emily continued organizing the newly arrived books, more to have something to do with her hands than out of necessity. "It's strange to discover that your entire life was built on untold stories. Sometimes we keep secrets thinking we're protecting those we love," Mrs. Cooper replied softly. "Your mother suffered a lot, Emily, but she never let that suffering affect the love she feels for you." "I know," sighed Emily, finally stopping what she was doing to face her family friend. "But now I understand so many things. The way she always avoided talking about the past, how she became tense when someone mentioned the old store in Soho." "And about Richard?" asked Mrs. Cooper gently. "How do you feel?" Emily felt her heart tighten. "He's my cousin." "Yes, but—" "That's not what I asked." Emily walked to the window, observing the movement on the street. The sky was cloudy, threatening rain, the same weather that made her heart seem too heavy for her chest. "It doesn't matter how I feel. Some stories are born with a predetermined ending." "Do you really believe that?" questioned Mrs. Cooper, her voice carrying a wisdom that came from years of observing the complexities of life. "That our destinies are written by events of the past? Aren't they?" "Emily," called Mrs. Cooper, getting up to join her at the window. "Remember when you were little and I taught you how to repair old books? How we recovered torn pages, glued loose spines?" "Of course," replied Emily, smiling at the memory. "You always said that a damaged book isn't lost. It just needs special care." "Exactly," smiled Mrs. Cooper. "The stories of our lives are like that too. We may find tears, lost pages, chapters that seem to make no sense, but we always have the chance to restore, retell, begin again." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Emily turned instinctively, but it wasn't Richard, just a regular customer looking for his special order. As she attended to him, she noticed that Mrs. Cooper was observing something on one of the oldest shelves. "You know," said the lady, taking a book with a faded red cover, "Anthony used to say that architecture wasn't just about building, but about creating spaces where stories could happen." Emily took the book from Mrs. Cooper's hands. It was one of the old volumes on modernist architecture that she always kept separate, without ever really understanding why. "You knew him well?" "Well enough to know that he never forgave himself for leaving," replied Mrs. Cooper, her voice soft. "But also well enough to understand that sometimes We need to lose something precious so that something even more precious can be born. Emily opened the book and a loose sheet slipped to the floor. It was an old note, the handwriting elegant, but firm. For Sarah. Because some loves are like buildings, they may seem impossible on paper, but with the right foundation, they withstand any storm. Anthony. He used to leave messages like this in various books, explained Mrs. Cooper, watching Emily absorb those words. Your mother found most of them over the years, but some must still be hidden around here, waiting to be discovered. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because, replied Mrs. Cooper, taking her hands in hers, sometimes we need to understand the past, not to repeat it, but to learn to write our own story in a different way. The rest of the afternoon passed like a hazy dream. Emily helped customers, organized books, made notes in the order book, all automatically, while her mind wandered between past and present, between what was and what could be. When night came, and she finally closed the bookstore, the rain that had threatened all day began to fall. Standing under the awning, waiting for the storm to pass, Emily realized that perhaps Mrs. Cooper was right. Perhaps some stories needed to be rewritten, not erased. Richard watched the rain fall through the windows of his office, the drops drawing, random patterns on the glass. A week had passed since his last visit to the bookstore, and each minute seemed loaded with the weight of unspoken words. On his desk, a pile of documents awaited his attention. Financial reports, ongoing projects, contracts to sign, but his eyes kept returning to the old photo of his uncle with Sarah, now framed and placed next to his computer. Your father is on line 1, announced Vanessa through the intercom, her voice cautious. She knew her boss well enough to notice the changes of the past few days. Richard took a deep breath before answering. Dad. Richard. William Matthews' voice was, as always, controlled, authoritative. Jason informed me about your decision regarding the Greenwich Village project. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, replied Richard, his voice firm. The decision has been made. Son, you can't let sentimentality interfere with business. That bookstore. That bookstore, interrupted Richard, belongs to the family, our family. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When William spoke again, his voice had a different tone. So you found out. About Uncle Anthony, about Sarah, about my cousin. Richard let out a humorless laugh. Yes, Dad, I discovered everything you tried to bury all these years. It was necessary, William defended himself. The family. Richard stood up, unable to contain his agitation. Was it because of the family that you destroyed Uncle Anthony's relationship? That you forced him to abandon the woman he loved? His own daughter? You don't understand, Richard. We were different back then. We had other values, No, cut Richard. Don't try to justify it. What you did was cruel, and now we have the chance to fix it, at least in part. There was another moment of silence, longer this time. What do you intend to do? Richard walked to the window, observing the city his family had helped build, and, in some cases, destroy. I'm going to redesign the project. The bookstore will not only remain intact, but will be the center of a new concept, a cultural space that preserves the neighborhood's history, that respects the past while embracing the future. That's going to cost millions, argued William, but his voice no longer carried the same conviction. Then it will cost millions, replied Richard simply. Some things are worth more than money, Dad. You should have learned that 30 years ago. After hanging up, Richard grabbed his briefcase and umbrella. Vanessa, cancel my afternoon appointments, he instructed, passing by his secretary's desk. But the meeting with the investors can wait, he completed, entering the elevator. I have something more important to do. The rain was still falling when he parked in front of the bookstore. Through the foggy glass he could see Emily organizing books, exactly as the first time he saw her. His heart accelerated, as it always did in her presence. But now there was something more, a feeling of purpose, of certainty. Before leaving, the car. He opened his briefcase and removed a folder with architectural projects he had spent the week developing. They weren't just plans and elevations. They were dreams drawn on paper, a vision of how the past and future could coexist harmoniously. The Iwa bell sounded when he opened the door, and Emily looked up from the books. For a moment they just looked at each other, the sound of the rain creating a bubble of silence around them. "I thought you wouldn't come back," she finally said, her voice low but firm. "I thought so too," admitted Richard, approaching the counter. "But then I realized I was making the same mistake my father made 30 years ago, letting fear dictate my choices." Emily observed him for a moment, her green eyes, Anthony's eyes, studying his face. "And what choices are those?" Richard placed the folder on the counter, opening it to reveal the drawings. "I have a proposal for you. For the bookstore. For us." The us hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings and possibilities. Emily looked at the projects, her fingers lightly brushing over the carefully traced lines. "What is this?" "A new beginning," replied Richard, his heart beating strongly in his chest. "A chance to rewrite our story, not by erasing the past, but by building something new upon it." Emily passed her fingers gently over the drawings that Richard had brought. The architectural plans showed a completely new vision for the block, with the bookstore as the central point of a cultural complex that preserved the essence of the neighborhood while modernizing it. "You want to transform the bookstore into a cultural center?" she asked, her voice mixing surprise and caution. "Not exactly transform," replied Richard, pulling another blueprint from the folder. "I want to expand. Look, we can keep the bookstore exactly as it is, preserving all its history, but add spaces for literary events, a cafe, rooms for writing workshops, and book restoration." "How did you know about the restoration workshops?" Richard smiled, slightly. "Mrs. Cooper might have mentioned something about that. In fact, she has been a valuable source of information about the history of this place." Emily felt her heart accelerate as she realized the care with which Richard had thought about every detail. The projects not only preserved the soul of the bookstore, but seemed to want to return something to it that had been lost over the years. "Why are you doing this, Richard?" she asked, finally raising her eyes from the drawings to face him. "Because some things deserve to be preserved," he replied, maintaining her gaze, "and others deserve the chance to grow, to transform into something even more special." The doorbell rang at that moment, and both turned to see Sarah entering the bookstore, leaning on her cane. She had insisted on coming despite the rainy weather, saying she needed to organize some old things. Upon seeing Richard, she stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was dense with untold stories and contained emotions. Richard was the first to move, taking a step toward her. "Mrs. Lawrence," he said softly, I would very much like to talk to you." Sarah studied Richard's face for a long moment, and Emily could see tears forming in her mother's eyes. "You have his eyes," she finally said. "The same eyes as Anthony." "You loved him very much, didn't you?" asked Richard gently. "More than the words in all these books could express," replied Sarah, walking slowly to the counter where the projects were spread out. "What is this?" "A proposal," replied Emily, closely watching her mother's reaction. "Richard has an idea for the bookstore." Sarah examined the drawings in silence, her fingers tracing the lines just as Emily had done moments before. "Anthony used to draw like this," she commented, her voice loaded with memories, as if each line could tell a story. "Mrs. Lawrence," began Richard, carefully choosing his words, "I know that nothing I do can erase what my family did in the past, but perhaps we can build something new. Something that honors the love you and my uncle shared. Something that preserves this bookstore for future generations." Sarah raised her eyes from the projects, looking first at Richard, then at her daughter. "And what do you think of this, Emily?" Emily felt the weight of the question. It wasn't just about the projects. It was about forgiveness, about new beginnings, about the possibility of building bridges over chasms that seemed impassable. "I think some stories deserve a new chapter," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. Sarah smiled, a smile Emily hadn't seen in a long time, full of hope and possibilities. Anthony always said that the best projects are those that preserve the soul of the place while preparing it for the future. "That's exactly what I intend to do," said Richard, opening another blueprint. "And there's one more thing." He took a document from the folder, carefully placing it on the counter. "This is the original registration of the bookstore with all the documentation that proves the property legitimately belongs to you. My lawyers are already preparing the papers to definitively resolve any pending legal issues." Sarah took the documents with trembling hands. "You found?" "In the company archives," confirmed Richard. "My father kept everything, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of some distorted sense of duty. But now we can use this to do the right thing." Emily watched her mother hug the documents against her chest, as if they were one of the precious books she loved so much. Silent tears ran down her face, but there was a smile on her lips, a smile of liberation, of forgiveness, of hope. The following weeks brought a different energy to Tidal Books. Richard's projects were put on display in one of the windows, attracting the curiosity of regular customers and bringing new visitors interested in learning about the future establishment. Emily discovered in herself a passion she didn't know she had. She began to actively involve herself in planning the cultural space, suggesting ideas for literary programs and activities that could bring the community even closer to the bookstore. "You should coordinate the cultural part of the project," suggested Richard one afternoon, as they reviewed the plans at the corner cafe. It was a new habit they had developed, professional meetings that always seemed to slide into more personal conversations. "Me?" Emily raised her eyebrows, surprised. "I don't have experience with that." "You have more than you think," he insisted. "You know literature, you know the community, you understand what this place means to people. That's worth more than any degree." Emily took a sip of her coffee, thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if our parents had made different choices." "How so?" "If my father hadn't left, if your family had accepted his relationship with my mother, would we be different people? Would we have met in another way?" Richard considered the question for a moment, playing with the bookmark with the blue flower that he now always carried with him. "Maybe, but we can't change the past, Emily. We can only learn from it and try to do better in the present." "Like you're doing with your father." Richard smiled sadly. "It's a process. He still doesn't completely understand, but he's trying. Last week he asked about you and your mother for the first time, without that tone of judgment in his voice. It must be difficult for him to admit he was wrong all these years." "It's more than that," replied Richard, leaning over the table. "It's admitting that he destroyed his own brother's happiness out of pride, out of fear of what others would say. That kind of guilt isn't easily resolved." Emily extended her hand, lightly touching Richard's on the table. It was the first time she had allowed herself this type of contact since they discovered their relationship. "But it can be the beginning of healing, can't it?" The touch sent an electric current through both of them, familiar and frightening at the same time. Richard intertwined his fingers with hers, and for a moment they stayed like that, connected by something that went beyond blood ties or stories from the past. "Emily," he began, his voice softer than normal, "I know our situation is complicated. I know we have a lot to consider, a lot to resolve, but I don't want to ignore what I feel for you." Emily felt her heart race, but she didn't withdraw her hand. "I don't want to ignore it either," she admitted. "But I'm afraid. Afraid that we're repeating a story that has already proven impossible once." "Or perhaps," replied Richard, gently squeezing her fingers, "we're writing a completely new story, one that our parents didn't have the chance to live." The noise of the cafe around them seemed to have disappeared, creating a bubble where only the two of them existed and all the possibilities that unfolded before them. "My mother said something interesting yesterday," commented Emily, a small smile playing on her lips. "She said that sometimes destiny needs 2 generations to get a story right." Richard smiled, that smile that always made Emily's heart skip a beat. "Your mother is a wise woman. She also said that she's proud of the man you've become. Different from your father, able to see beyond money and power. And you? asked Richard, his voice almost a whisper. "What are you proud of?" Emily looked at their intertwined hands, at the bookstore project on the table, at the future they were beginning to build together. "Of us," she replied simply, "of how we chose to be greater than our history." Autumn arrived in New York, bringing a cooler breeze and changes that went beyond the weather. Tidal books buzzed with the energy of the transformations to come. Emily had begun to digitally catalogue the entire collection, preparing for the expansion, while Richard finalized the last details of the project with his team. On a particularly busy afternoon, Jason, Richard's partner, appeared at the bookstore. Emily recognized him immediately from Richard's description. Tall, always well-dressed, with an air of perpetual concern on his face. "So this is it," he said, looking around, with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The place that made Richard Matthews rethink his entire business philosophy. Emily straightened her posture, feeling instinctively defensive. "Can I help you?" Jason approached the counter, studying her carefully. "You must be Emily. Richard talks a lot about you." "And you must be Jason," she replied, maintaining a professional tone. "Richard also talks about you." "I imagine not as well as before," he commented with an ironic smile. "Since he decided to revolutionize our biggest project of the year because of this bookstore." Emily felt her blood boil, but kept her calm. Years of dealing with difficult customers had taught her the value of self-control. "This bookstore has been the cultural heart of this neighborhood for decades, and it will continue to be," said a firm voice behind them. Richard was standing at the door, a serious expression on his face. "Jason, what are you doing here?" "I came to know the place that's causing so much commotion among the investors," replied Jason, turning to face his partner. "Richard, we need to talk. The numbers for the new project can wait," cut Richard, his voice leaving no room for argument. "My office tomorrow morning." Jason looked from Richard to Emily, then back to Richard. "You're different," he commented, shaking his head. "I've never seen you postpone a discussion about numbers before." "Maybe because I've finally learned that some things are more important than numbers," replied Richard, walking to the counter and positioning himself next to Emily. After Jason left, a heavy silence settled in the bookstore. Emily could feel the tension in Richard's shoulders, the way he tried to control his breathing. "I'm sorry about that," he finally said. "Jason can be intense when it comes to business." "As you were?" asked Emily softly. Richard looked at her, surprised by the question. "Yes," he admitted after a moment. "Maybe even worse. I only saw numbers, deadlines, profits. Now I see stories," he completed, his eyes scanning the old shelves. "I see lives, memories, possibilities, and that scares a lot of people in my world." Emily began organizing some recently returned books, more to occupy her restless hands than out of necessity. "Are you sure you want to continue with this? The project, the changes, Jason is right, you're risking a lot." Richard approached, gently, taking the book she was holding. "You know what's ironic? For years I built buildings thinking I was creating legacies, but this place, this bookstore that my family tried to destroy, is a much truer legacy. And now I have the chance to be part of it, to transform it into something even more special. Even if it means facing your father, your partners, your entire world." "Especially because of that," he replied, placing the book on the shelf and turning to face her. "Emily, I've spent my entire life following a path that others traced for me. For the first time, I'm choosing my own direction. And yes, it's scary, but it's also liberating," she completed, a small smile playing on her lips. "Exactly," agreed Richard, returning the smile. "How do you always know the right word?" "Years of reading books, I presume," she joked, but her eyes were serious. "Richard, about us, yes? I don't want you to sacrifice everything you've built. Not for me, not for the bookstore." Richard took a step toward her, reducing the distance between them. "It's not a sacrifice when you're building something you truly believe in. Besides," he added, his intense gaze fixed on hers, "some things are worth any risk." The doorbell rang at that moment and they instinctively moved apart. It was Mrs. Cooper, carrying an old box that seemed too heavy for her fragile arms. "I found more treasures," she announced, placing the box on the counter. "Your mother asked me to bring them. They're some of Anthony's old books, the ones he left behind when, well, you know." Emily and Richard approached the box together. Inside were dusty volumes, some with page markers still intact, others with annotations in the margins in an elegant handwriting that Emily recognized from the letters her mother kept. "He always said that the best projects begin with research," commented Mrs. Cooper, observing them with a knowing smile. "Perhaps these books can help with the new bookstore project." The next morning, Emily decided to arrive earlier at the bookstore. She wanted to have time to examine the books Mrs. Cooper had brought before customers started arriving. What she found left her breathless. They weren't just architecture books, but notebooks, project sketches, and most surprising of all, a diary. With trembling hands, she opened the leather-bound notebook. The first entry was dated 30 years, ergo a few days before Anthony left. "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to say in person everything that needed to be said. The projects I designed for us will remain only on paper, like so many dreams I couldn't realize. But I leave with you something more important. The truth about who I am, about the choices I made, about the love that will always be greater than any building I could ever construct." Emily couldn't continue reading. Tears blurred her vision. It was the first time she had direct access to her father's thoughts, to his most intimate voice. "Emily?" She looked up to find Richard standing at the door of the bookstore, a concerned expression on his face. Without saying anything, she held out the diary to him. Richard approached, taking the notebook with reverential care. His eyes scanned the first lines, and she saw something change in his face, as if another piece of the puzzle of their family history had fallen into place. "He wrote this for your mother," said Richard softly, "but never delivered it." "No," confirmed Emily, wiping away her tears, like so many other things that were left unsaid. Richard placed the diary on the counter and took Emily's hands in his. "Maybe that's why we're here now, to say what they couldn't, to build what they couldn't." Emily looked at their joined hands, feeling the familiar warmth that always invaded her when she was near him. "Richard, what are we doing, really?" "We're writing our own story," he replied without hesitation. "One that doesn't have to end like theirs." "But people will always talk," he interrupted gently, "just as they talked about your parents. The difference is that now we have a choice. We can let fear separate us as happened to them, or we can be brave enough to follow our hearts." Emily released her hands and walked to the window. The morning sun was beginning to bathe the streets of Greenwich Village, giving a golden glow to the old buildings. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "afraid that this will hurt my mother, that it will bring back painful memories." "Have you talked to her about us?" "Not directly," replied Emily, turning to face him. "But I think she knows, the way she looks at us when we're together, how she smiles when I mention your name." "And what do you think she feels?" Emily thought for a moment, remembering the small changes she had noticed in her mother in recent weeks, the renewed sparkle in her eyes, the energy with which she participated in plans for the new bookstore, the way she had begun to share more stories about the past. "I think she's at peace," she finally replied, "as if seeing you doing differently from your father, choosing a different path, brings some kind of healing for her too." Richard approached, stopping a few steps away. "And you? Are you at peace with this?" Emily felt her heart accelerate. It was a question she had been asking herself for weeks. "When I'm with you," she began slowly, "I don't think about surnames or stories from the past. I think only about how alive I feel, about how everything seems to make sense in a way it never did before. But then I remember that you're my cousin, that our families have a complicated history, that people might not understand." Richard took another step toward her. "Emily, look at me," he asked softly. When their gazes met, he continued, "What we feel for each other isn't defined by our kinship or the history of our families. Go as something new, something ours, And if people don't understand how, well, maybe they don't need to understand, maybe they just need to respect. At that moment, a ray of sunlight entered through the window, illuminating the diary on the counter. Emily looked at it, thinking of all the unspoken words it contained, of all the dreams her father couldn't realize. "You know what else I found in his books?" she asked, walking to the counter and picking up one of the old volumes. "Projects. Dozens of them. For this bookstore, for other places. He never stopped dreaming even after he left." "Like you," observed Richard, "always writing, always imagining new possibilities." Emily smiled, feeling a wave of certainty invade her. "Maybe that's what we should do then. Not just preserve the past, but give it a new meaning. Transform a story of separation into one of union." Richard took her hand again, and this time Emily didn't hesitate to intertwine her fingers with his. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she replied, feeling as if finally all the loose pages of her life were beginning to form a complete story. The news about the transformation of Tidal Books into a cultural center spread quickly through the neighborhood. What began as a whisper among regular customers soon transformed into a wave of interest and support from the community. Emily was surprised by the number of people who appeared daily offering help, sharing memories, or simply wanting to know more about the project. On a particularly busy morning, while organizing a pile of books donated by a local university, Emily received an unexpected visit. William Matthews, Richard's father, was standing at the entrance of the bookstore, looking out of place in his impeccable suit. "Mr. Matthews," Emily greeted, trying to keep her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions that his presence provoked. "You look very much like your mother," he said, taking a few hesitant steps into the store. "You have the same determined eyes." Emily didn't respond immediately, observing the man who had so greatly influenced her family's history. Up close, he seemed less intimidating than she had imagined. There was a fragility in his eyes that she hadn't expected to find. "Richard isn't here," she informed him, returning to organizing the books. "Actually," replied William, "I came to talk to you." This made her stop. Turning completely toward him, Emily crossed her arms. About second chances," he said, removing an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "And about trying to fix past mistakes." Emily took the envelope he extended, opening. Read carefully. Inside were legal documents and, to her surprise, an old photo, the same one she had seen in Richard's office, but this one seemed more preserved. "Anthony took this photo the day he met your mother," explained William, his voice softer now. "He was so happy. I had never seen him like that before, and I destroyed that." "Why?" The question escaped Emily's lips before she could contain it. William walked to the window, observing the busy street outside. "Pride, prejudice, fear that the family name would be tarnished, all the excuses that seemed so important at the time and so empty afterward." He turned to face her again. "When Richard told me about you, about this place, about his plans, I confess that my first reaction was anger. I thought I was losing my son just as I lost my brother, but then I realized that maybe this was my chance to do the right thing this time." Emily opened the documents and began reading them, her eyes widening as she understood their content. "This is a donation," completed William, "of the land adjacent to the bookstore to expand the cultural project that Richard is planning. And also," he hesitated for a moment, "a formal apology to your mother, with legal recognition of all the damage caused in the past." Emily felt her hands tremble. "Why now?" "Because I realized I was making the same mistake twice," he replied, running his hand through his graying hair. "I saw in my son's eyes the same spark I saw in my brother's eyes 30 years ago, and this time I don't want to be the villain of the story." At that moment, the doorbell rang again, and Sarah entered the bookstore. She stopped abruptly upon seeing William, her face paling. "Sarah," said William softly, taking a step toward her, "there is so much I need to say." Sarah raised a hand, stopping him. "It's been 30 years, William. What could you say now that would change anything?" "Nothing," he admitted. "I can't change the past, but perhaps I can help build a better future. For them," he completed, looking significantly at Emily. Sarah walked slowly to her daughter, taking the documents from her hands and examining them. After a few moments that seemed like an eternity, she looked up at William. "You know it's not just about the land or the money, don't you?" "I know," he replied. "It's about family, about accepting that love is more important than name or status. It took me 3 decades to learn this, but I finally understood." Sarah nodded slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. Anthony would be proud to see this. "He would be prouder to see what his daughter and my son are building together," replied William. "Something that he and you dreamed of but couldn't achieve." Emily observed the interaction between them, feeling as if she were witnessing not just a reconciliation, but the closing of a cycle that had begun long before her birth. It was as if the final pieces of a complex puzzle were finally finding their place. When Richard arrived at the bookstore that afternoon, he found a scene he never expected to see. His father, Sarah, and Emily sitting together in the small improvised cafe at the back of the store, talking about expansion plans. There was a lightness in the air that seemed to have dissipated decades of hurt and resentment. "Son," called William upon seeing him, standing up, "I was just showing Sarah and Emily some ideas for the reading garden we can create on the new land." Richard looked at Emily, who nodded with a small smile, confirming that everything was fine. He approached the group, noticing the sketches spread out on the table, drawings he recognized as being from his own father, something he hadn't seen in years. "You're drawing again?" he asked, surprised. William smiled, a smile that Richard hadn't seen since his childhood. "Let's say your uncle wasn't the only one in the family with a talent for architecture. It's just that I chose other paths." "It's never too late to resume old dreams," commented Sarah softly, and there was an understanding in her voice that made everyone at the table emotional. "No," agreed William, "especially when we have the chance to realize them in a different way through our children." Emily stood up, walking to one of the nearby shelves. She returned with Anthony's diary, which she had found days earlier. "I think you should see this," she said, handing the notebook to William. The older man took the diary with trembling hands, immediately recognizing his brother's handwriting. "It was among the books that Mrs. Cooper brought," explained Emily. "They're his thoughts, his dreams, his projects, including some for this bookstore." William opened the notebook with reverential care, his eyes scanning the yellowed pages. As he read, silent tears began to run down his face. "He never hated me," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. "Even after everything I did, he still believed that one day I would understand." "And you did," said Richard, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Maybe not in his time, but you did." Sarah stood up, walking to the window. The afternoon sun painted the sky in orange tones, creating elongated shadows on the street. "No," she began, her voice loaded with memories. "Anthony always said that the best projects are those that can unite past and future, tradition and innovation. I think that's exactly what we're doing here." Emily approached Richard, who naturally put his arm around her waist. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by William, who looked up from the diary to observe them. "You have my blessing," he said softly. "In fact, I think you always had it. I just needed a good shake from destiny to realize it." "And what about the investors?" asked Richard, remembering Jason's concerns. "The board—" "Leave the investors to me," interrupted William, a familiar gleam of determination in his eyes. "It's time for Matthew's construction to start building more than just buildings. We can create spaces that really matter, that make a difference in people's lives." "Like a bookstore that transforms into a cultural center?" suggested Emily with a smile. "Exactly," agreed William, "and who knows, in the process we may also rebuild our family." Sarah rejoined the group, bringing with her a small box that Emily had never seen before. "Speaking of family," she said, opening the box, "I think it's time to share some more memories." From inside the box, she removed more photographs, letters, and small objects that told the story of her love with Anthony. But there was also something else. Projects, dozens of them, to transform the bookstore into a cultural space, drawn 30 years ago. "He never gave up on the dream," explained Sarah, spreading the drawings on the table. Even after leaving, he continued planning, dreaming. And now we can realize those dreams, completed Richard, studying the projects with professional interest, not exactly as he imagined, but with the same spirit. Emily picked up one of the drawings, immediately recognizing the style she had seen in Richard's projects. It was as if the talent for architecture, the eye for beauty and functionality, had passed from generation to generation, connecting them through time. 6 months passed like pages being turned in a well-loved book. Tidal Books remained open during the entire renovation of the annexed space, which gradually took shape according to projects that combined the visions of Anthony, Richard, and William. Emily observed the changes from the bookstore window, admiring how the new and the old intertwined harmoniously. The original bookstore space remained intact, preserving its soul and history, while beside it a modern cultural center emerged, with glass walls that reflected the sky and let natural light flood the environments. "What are you thinking about?" asked Richard, approaching from behind and encircling her waist. In recent months they had allowed themselves to demonstrate their affection more openly, encouraged by the surprising support they received from both families. "About how everything has changed," she replied, leaning back against him, "and how at the same time the essence remains the same." Richard smiled, perfectly understanding what she meant. The bookstore still smelled of old books and possibilities, still had the same bell on the door and the same dark wooden shelves. But now there was also a literary cafe, rooms for writing workshops and book restoration, and a reading garden that seemed to come straight out of a fairy tale. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "Actually, I think he is. Somewhere." Emily nodded, thinking of Anthony's diary that now occupied a place of honor in a special display case, along with some of his original projects. "You know what moves me the most? Seeing your mother so involved with all this." Indeed, Sarah had flourished in recent months. Her health had improved considerably, as if the weight of kept secrets had been replaced by new energy. She now spent afternoons in the reading garden, telling stories to neighborhood children or guiding book restoration workshops. "And my father," added Richard, still surprised by William's transformation. Who would have thought he would become the project's biggest defender? It was true. William Matthews had surprised everyone, not only by supporting the transformation of the bookstore, but also by becoming personally involved in the project. He had rediscovered his passion for architecture and now spent hours discussing details with Richard, suggesting improvements and mainly trying to incorporate elements of Anthony's original projects. "People change," reflected Emily, turning in Richard's arms to face him. "Sometimes they just need the right opportunity." "Like me?" he asked with a mischievous smile. "Like all of us," she corrected, kissing him softly. "This bookstore has always been a place of transformations, now more than ever." The sound of animated voices coming from the garden attracted their attention. Mrs. Cooper was conducting another of her popular bookmark workshops, teaching the new generation to embroider the same blue flowers that had unwittingly united so many stories. "I still can't believe we're going to inaugurate next week," commented Emily, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. "Everything will be fine," assured Richard, taking her hand and intertwining their fingers. "The place is practically ready. The events are all scheduled, and Jason finally stopped complaining about the costs after he saw the media interest in the project." Emily laughed, remembering the expression on Richard's partner's face when an important architecture magazine wanted to do a story about the transformation of the bookstore. The story of forbidden love, family reconciliation, and urban renewal had captured people's imagination in a way no one expected. "You know what makes me happiest?" she asked, walking with Richard to the new cafe, where the aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the familiar smell of books. "Seeing how this place is becoming exactly what it always should have been, a meeting point, a place where old and new stories meet." "Like us," completed Richard, stopping to admire one of the photo panels that decorated the cafe walls. In it, old images of the bookstore mingled with recent photographs, visually telling the story of the space's transformation. One photo in particular stood out, Anthony and Sarah, young, smiling, in front of the old facade in Soho, alongside a new one recently taken, showing Emily and Richard at the same angle, with the same sparkle in their eyes. "Sometimes I wonder," said Emily thoughtfully, "if all of this wasn't part of a grand plan of destiny, as if each book sold, each bookmark embroidered, each decision made inevitably brought us here." Richard smiled, that smile that always made Emily's heart beat faster. "If it was a plan of destiny, then I'm eternally grateful to it. But I prefer to think that it was our choices that brought us here. Choices different from those our parents made. Choices based on love and courage instead of fear." The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of more visitors, eager to see the changes. Emily and Richard naturally separated, ready to receive the curious, but their gazes met once more, carrying a silent promise that their story, unlike Anthony and Sarah's, would have a happy ending. The day of the inauguration of the new title, Books Cultural Center, dawned with a perfectly blue sky, as if New York City itself wanted to celebrate the moment. The doors were opened at 10 in the morning, and a line of people was already anxiously waiting to see the renovated space. Emily was in the reading garden, adjusting some final details, when she felt a hand touch her shoulder. It was her mother, more beautiful than ever, in a navy blue dress that matched the tones of the place. "Everything is perfect, honey," said Sarah, her eyes shining with emotion. "Exactly as your father imagined. Maybe even better." Before Emily could respond, William and Richard joined them. William carried an old box which he handed to Sarah with a gentle smile. "I found this in the company archives," he explained. "I think today is the perfect day to open it." Sarah opened the box carefully, and her eyes filled with tears. Inside were dozens of bookmarks with embroidered blue flowers, some already yellowed by time but all perfectly preserved. "Anthony made them in his spare time," explained William. After he left, he continued sending them anonymously to the bookstore. I intercepted the deliveries. Another of my past mistakes. But now they have found their way back," completed Richard softly. Emily took one of the bookmarks, noticing that each had a small message embroidered on the back. There were excerpts from poems, book quotations, small declarations of love, a diary in the form of bookmarks that Anthony had created over the years. "Let's distribute them today," decided Sarah, wiping away her tears. "To the first people who buy books at the inauguration. That way, a part of him will be present in this moment." The main doors were opened, and the public began to enter. The space was soon filled with animated voices, expressions of surprise and joy. Children ran to the children's reading space, while local writers gathered in the literary cafe, already planning future events. Jason, who had finally surrendered to the charm of the project, was leading a group of journalists through the space, proudly explaining how Matthew's construction was revolutionizing the concept of urban revitalization, preserving local culture. Mrs. Cooper, seated in her special chair in the reading garden, was already surrounded by children eager to learn how to embroider flowers on bookmarks. Her wrinkled hands moved with the same grace as always, transforming threads and fabrics into small works of art. In the late afternoon, when the sun began to set, Emily found Richard alone on the second-floor balcony, observing the movement. Below, she approached silently, but he sensed her presence. "We did it," he said, pulling her close. "Yes," agreed Emily, resting her head on his shoulder. "And this is just the beginning." Richard took something from his pocket, a bookmark with a blue flower, but this one was new, freshly embroidered. "For you," he said, handing it to Emily. She turned the bookmark and read the message embroidered. On the back, "Marry me?" Her hands trembled slightly as she raised her eyes to meet Richard's. He was smiling, that smile that had changed her life on that Saturday afternoon, almost a year ago. "Here?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Now, what better place?" he replied. "This space represents everything we are, everything we overcame, everything we built together. It's proof that some stories deserve a second chance, that love can be stronger than fear." Emily looked down at the reading garden where her mother and William were animatedly conversing, at the shelves of the original bookstore that now connected harmoniously with the new space, at the visitors discovering each corner with amazed eyes. "Yes," she answered, looking back at Richard. "1,000 times yes." The kiss that followed was witnessed only by the New York sunset and by a gentle breeze that made Anthony's bookmarks dance in the hands of new readers, as if he too were there, blessing that moment.